Since the civil war in Nepal finished in 2006, there's been some very significant progress in terms of peace building. The Maoist rebels have been drawn into the mainstream. They've formed a political party and they've been very politically active. Many of their fighters have been integrated into the Nepali army, which is really a very, very important step. There's also been some political processes which have been much more inclusive than previously. There have been 2 elections for constituent assemblies, one in 2008 and one in 2013, both of which have been free and fair, and which have seen a much broader range of groups, including some of the very excluded groups in Nepal, come into the political process. It's been very, very important. The main stumbling for Nepal's peace process remains the constitution. When the war finished in 2006, it was decided that the monarchy would be abolished and Nepal would become a federal republic. There were elections in 2008 to a constituent assembly. That assembly sat for a number of years and it was not able to come up with any constitution. There was profound disagreement. Finally, it was dissolved, and last year we saw elections for a new constituent assembly, which is now committing that they will write a constitution by 2015. However, the actual political configuration hasn't shifted very much, so it's questionable whether they will have much more success than the previous assembly. Really, at the base of this problem is disagreements about the nature of the federal state that Nepal should be. Disagreements between the political elite, who would like to see a state that furthers their interest, and the excluded groups, whether they are identity-based groups, caste-based groups, or regional groups, who have now come into politics and want to see a federal state that furthers their interest. Particularly, there is really a disagreement about whether or not federalism should be based on identity. India has always been the dominant power in Nepal. There's an open border between the two countries. There's strong cultural, political, economic ties. However, India has been losing power in Nepal in recent years since the end of the conflict, partly because the Maoist rebels, who have now taken a big political part in the country, have been generally very anti-Indian, and partly because of growing influence of China. For that reason, India has played in many ways a rather negative role in Nepal's peace process. They have been keen to undermine any political progress that would reduce their influence in the country, and particularly they spent a long time trying to block, for example, the integration of Maoist fighters into the Nepal army, because they felt that this would turn the Nepal army into an anti-Indian institution. So India, in a sense, has a role which is, they are very, very engaged in Nepali politics. They've been micromanaging, blocking the progress in political movements. And India's interest in Nepal is really to keep it a country that is rather weak, rather politically fractured, and very much dominated by India. On the other hand, what we see, China's influence in Nepal has increased since the end of the conflict. This is partly because the Maoists, as I was saying, came into power and perhaps were more favourable towards China. But it's also because China has invested very heavily in Nepal. They've become a major investor, big donor. They've now dominating important sectors like the telecom sector, like the tourism sector. And they've also engaged in much more high-level political contact with Nepal. Now, China's interest in Nepal vary quite differently to India's. China wants to see a stable Nepal. It wants to see primarily a Nepal that will help maintain security along the Tibetan border. But of course this is problematic, because what China wants in many ways is a Nepal that is willing to violate the rights of Tibetan refugees. The EU, together with member states, is Nepal's biggest donor, and they work in a lot of sectors, and they've been particularly involved in supporting progress around peace, around human rights, around inclusion, and these very important agendas which really need to be there if we're going to have a long-term sustainable peace. The EU has a particularly important role to play in terms of its neutrality, because Nepal is so heavily dominated by India and China, both of whom have very clear interests in the country. The fact that the EU doesn't have any particular interest beyond being a development donor has allowed it, for example, to engage in political processes, to offer support, to engage with breakaway political factions in a way that the other countries, the 2 big neighbours, have not been able to do, or not trusted to do by the Nepali people. So I think it's very important that the EU remains committed to Nepal, and they continue to play this neutral role and as a development donor and a supporter of peace.